Get out! We want our space!" Her voice ricocheted through the living room like a thrown glass. It landed on the chandelier, on the faded Persian rug, on the very keys I still held in my hand. It was the kind of sentence you don't expect to hear in the house you've lived in for 50 years. The house where you learned to dance, the house where you buried your husband, where your son took his first steps. Vanessa's face, all cool composure and a smile that never reached her eyes, was inches from mine. Michael stood behind her with his hands in his pockets, his mouth a thin line. I felt the air leave the room. For a moment I could only hear the tick of the grandfather clock, Harold's clock, like a metronome marking the end of everything I thought I knew. I had given them the keys. I had handed over that house because my son said he needed help, because Harold and I had always done what we could for family. I had not imagined that the generosity of an old woman could be pronounced a trespasser's offense on her own doorstep. My name is Eleanor. I turned 79 last summer, though wrinkles and birthdays hardly explain the slow hardening of the heart. This is the story of how being kind without boundaries left me vulnerable in ways I didn't understand at first, and how, after a long and painful unraveling, I found my agency again, starting by calling my realtor and taking back what was mine. If any part of this resonates with you, if you've ever felt pushed aside by people you love, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. I'd like to know I'm not alone in this. Harold would have laughed if he could have seen the exchange. He loved a good joke, especially at his own expense. He used to say the maples outside our colonial on Maple Street were the only thing that made him keep a tidy lawn. The house was not grand in a public way, but it was ours. The stained glass window above the stair landing that filtered morning light into rainbows. The side porch where we kept lemon tarts for summer visitors. The small study where Harold kept his ledger and the letters he never threw away. When Harold died, grief rearranged the furniture of my life. Michael was 38 then, and the world had worn him ragged, work that paid too little, a business that refused to bloom, a rent that rose every year. He came to visit more often, first in fits and then with a steady rhythm. One evening, over coffee and the mild scent of lemon, he said the words every worried mother hates and yet wants to hear. "I'm doing my best, Mom. I just need a little help." He described the bank notices like they were a weather report, cold and inevitable. I remember the way he tucked a curl behind his ear, the way his laughter faltered. Harold would have insisted we take care of him. So I told him to come home, and I told him to bring Vanessa, and I unlocked the house with the conviction of someone sealing a promise. It felt right at the time. Not charity, just family. I pictured late Sunday dinners again, the house crowded with voices, the maples full of birds. I imagined Michael and Vanessa finding their footing, paying off a debt, returning to ordinary life. What I did not imagine was how slowly the small acceptances would turn into exclusions, the gradual rerouting of affection so subtle that it seemed like negligence rather than malice. At first the changes were tiny, the kind you would excuse if you were generous. A canceled dinner here, a missed birthday lunch there, but the small stones built a cairn. I would arrive with lasagna steaming from the oven, and the door would be answered with a polite smile and a recitation of obligations. At gatherings I started to feel like an extra coat, present but there only in case of rain. The first winter after Harold, Catherine, Vanessa's mother, who had been friendly but not close, mentioned, "They are busy these days. Maybe we'll see you next week," and never did. The first thing I noticed missing was a brooch, Harold's mother's diamond, a pin I would slip on for special days. I had always kept it in a tiny wooden box in my jewelry drawer, next to a folded paper of stamps Harold collected as a boy. One afternoon I opened the drawer for no good reason and felt a cold little absence, like a missing tooth. The box was there, empty and clean. At first I thought I had misplaced it in the laundry. Old women lose things. But as days passed, and calls to ask if they had seen it collected nothing, I felt a low, steady dread. Then there was the birthday that stung. My 17th wedding anniversary had been a small sun for me, a day Harold always exaggerated as though it were our coronation. That year, I sent a card, because Michael insisted celebrations were unnecessary with their schedules. When I arrived at the house with a simple cake, the light on the mantel told the story. A photograph of Michael and Vanessa at a restaurant ballooned in size, candles on the table, laughter caught in a freeze frame. No one greeted me at the door. The cake I'd carried sat on the counter like an afterthought. Later, I learned there had been a small party, friends from Vanessa's work, a playlist that matched her tastes, laughter that didn't quite reach the places I used to live in. A few things disappeared over those months. The quilt I had stitched in my younger years, a pattern Harold called a map for lost things, was gone from the trunk at the foot of the guest bed. The stained glass, which had been pried out on one cold evening and replaced by a plain sheet of glass and stainless handles, stopped catching the morning like it used to. The rooms changed their faces in a way that felt intimate and violent at once, a liquid intrusion of modern finishes that refused to be gentle about what they replaced. I thought of asking Michael gently about these things. I thought of knocking on the door and demanding explanations like a woman I used to be. But I hesitated, because I kept telling myself that I had given them the house. I had signed the guest registry as if handing over a favor, not a territory. And besides, I feared the truth, that my son and his wife were capable of setting the old world aside and wanting a new life. So I softened my questions into meanderings. I said nothing the day I found the divorce papers. I found them by accident in Harold's study, tucked behind a stack of sewing patterns he had once kept for me. They were thin and official-looking, stamped with a county name, of which I now confess I have a cloudy recollection, and a date that I could not immediately place. At the time I saw them, my first feeling was confusion. Why would Harold have divorce papers? He had been married for 50 years. Then another, colder feeling. Paperwork to separate oneself is not a private whim. It is a preparation. Everything in me wanted to ask who had put them there and why. But grief and memory are tricky. The papers felt like a private relic, so I folded them back and placed them in his top drawer, promising myself I would look properly when I had the courage. I never did, until the day I needed courage enough to pull at the seam of things. The small betrayals kept accumulating. A contractor was recommended for minor updates. I had been told, with that practiced casualness people use when covering a plan, that the stained glass was outdated. They offered a color scheme, stainless handles, recessed lighting, a bigger kitchen. They did it quickly, as if speed would blunt the sense of theft. I watched from the hallway while a man with a drill set loosed the frame that had held our family's morning light for decades. When I asked why they hadn't told me, Vanessa said with a trained indifference that it was a style improvement and that she had paid for it herself. She said it as if payment erased the history. The day the contractor came back was the day the words were thrown at me. They were changing the landing, and a man was balancing on a ladder when Vanessa stepped around me with clear purpose. She had a phone in one hand, and the other kept adjusting a strand of her hair. I remember the smell of sawdust and the way the falling light sliced into dust motes. Michael's voice was small. I had leaned on the banister because the ladder meant I could watch the work, an old woman's curiosity, and Vanessa's expression shifted. She motioned, half to the ladder, half to me. "Get out," she said, perfectly clipped. "We want our space." Those words, an imperative, a dismissal, were not merely about that landing. They declared a new geography of the household, her territory, their tastes, my exile. When she spoke, the maples outside seemed to lean away. I remember my hands around my purse. The keys to the house were still there in my pocket, as if they had become a mockery. I stood for a second, the heat in my face like a stage light, feeling ridiculous and enraged in equal measure. Michael's face was a study in conflict. He did not step in. He stood, a bystander between his wife's sword and his mother's hurt. I walked out to my car without a backward glance, because anger was too sharp and sorrow too soft to navigate in that moment. I did not go to a lawyer that night. I drove to Patricia's house instead, my neighbor and a friend who had known Harold since before I had known him. Patricia had the kind of sturdiness that kept wobbly things from falling. She opened the door in a robe, hair in rollers, like any friend would in an emergency. "Was that the last straw?" she asked without preamble, which is to say she asked with the blunt sympathy of someone who had been married to a lifetime. I told her the words. She told me to come inside. We sat across from each other with mugs cooling between our hands. I told her about the brooch, the birthday, the prying out of the window. I told her about the divorce papers and how Harold's drawers sometimes seemed to be holding more secrets than memory wanted to bear. "You gave them everything," she said, not unkindly. "You did the right thing for your boy." She reached out and took my hand. But kindness doesn't mean being taken. That night I made the first calls. I called Mr. Reynolds, Harold's longtime accountant, an efficient man with sad eyes, who had been Harold's rock when numbers got muddled by grief. I called him with the tremor of someone dissolving in loneliness and asked him, plainly, to check something, anything that might explain why things were changing and why that clock seemed to be chiming in someone else's house. I left a message on his office line and then rung Mr. Goldstein, Harold's lawyer, who had come to us for estate matters once a decade. I asked if he could look at a few papers when convenient. He offered to stop by the next morning. I also called Richard, my realtor, though it felt scandalous to do so. The idea of selling my house had been a private fantasy for weeks, less an escape than a reclamation. I knew selling would be a sharp cut. People think of selling as an ending, but sometimes endings are beginnings in disguise. I could imagine the newspapers not because I wanted attention, but because there are moments when a woman needs to reshuffle her life without the clutter of people who have soured into strangers. I told Richard I needed his discretion. He said he would come by after lunch. The decision to call Richard was not easy. It felt like admitting defeat and asserting control at once. I had always imagined leaving the house to Michael in my will. It had been a promise of sorts, the point of a life quietly built together. But promises depend on trust, and trust had become thin as tissue. When I thought of the maples, I thought of Harold's hands raking the leaves, of his fingers stained with the tang of lemon tart. I thought of the stained glass and the quilt and the brooch. For reasons that were both selfish and practical, I wanted to take action before the house was emptied of more than furniture. In the days that followed, small allies emerged. Rose Martinez, who had been Harold's assistant for years. She had handled his mail, made coffee for book club meetings, remembered the names of neighbors, offered to help me sort through his office files. Rose had a straightforward face and a soft voice. She showed up one morning with a box of gloves and a resolve that made me feel less alone. We began to unfold Harold's papers like petals. In one envelope, beneath an old program for a play we had attended, was a document I had seen before, the divorce papers I had tucked away in a grief-driven fog. Seeing them now, unfurled on the kitchen table, they had new edges. "I thought you should have these, Mrs. Turner," Rose said quietly. "Why here?" I asked. She shrugged her shoulders as if to wish the answer off the table. "People keep records for all sorts of reasons. He may have been preparing, or he may have kept other people's things in case." She did not elaborate. She is someone who does not gossip with thinness. But the presence of those papers became a hinge in my thinking. Preparing was not the same as intending. Harold's mind had always been careful, noting and storing, but the act of keeping records made me feel that secrets could be found if you looked. I started looking. I do not recommend this method for everyone. Digging often opens wounds that were better left to heal slowly. But for me, knowledge felt like armor. I asked Mr. Reynolds to do a preliminary sweep of our accounts. He called back within 2 days and used the kind of language accountants use when they do not want to alarm, but must. There were discrepancies, he said, small at first but accumulating. He did not give me numbers over the phone, only the fact that there were transactions that did not correlate with household expenses. He suggested we meet with documents. It is strange to recount the moment you first sit across from your own life in ledger form. Mr. Reynolds brought a binder and a patience that felt clinical and kind. He placed a stack of statements on the table. There was handwriting I recognized, Harold's scrawl on sticky notes, reminders he had left himself to water the succulents, and then entries that made me look up sharply, withdrawals and credit activity categorized in ways that did not match what a modest household would require. "This isn't about a dinner out," he said. "The pattern looks like someone using accounts over extended periods, but I want to be careful. We'll need more context." I felt my face heat. It was easier to weather storms that were visible: a broken window, a missing brooch, the sound of someone's laugh where yours used to be. But seeing numbers on paper with unfamiliar amounts, lines on a ledger that suggested movement beneath the surface, made the betrayal feel measured and intentional. "We'll hire someone to verify," Mr. Reynolds said gently. "A private investigator can reconcile date to date, and you should not confront anyone with this before you have the documents." The phrase, "don't confront," smelled like caution and was hard to swallow. I wanted to confront right away, to lay the paper on the coffee table and watch faces change. That fantasy lasted half a night. The next morning, when Vanessa answered the door with the crisp efficiency of someone running a polished household, I pressed my palms to the banister and thought of the chandelier, how it used to turn light into something like joy. I thought of the key still heavy in my purse. The day I decided to call Richard, the realtor, everything seemed to pulse with an odd clarity. It was not a temper tantrum or a rash escape. It was a sobered choice. I wanted the house out of the middle of my life as a place that carried other people's resentments. I wanted to stop being the woman who tiptoed around slights like paper-thin glass. Selling the house did not erase the past, but it could prevent future erosions. Richard arrived as promised, a tall man with a gentle voice and a folder of possible buyers who liked older homes. He walked through the rooms with a professional tenderness, his finger sometimes brushing the woodwork as if he were measuring more than square feet. He asked about the house's history, about its idiosyncrasies, and he listened when I spoke of Harold. He did not laugh at my reluctance to sell. He simply noted the value of discretion. "You want an off-market sale," he said. "A quiet buyer who respects the history. We can place it with a few retirees who are looking for something like this." The idea of strangers touching my fixtures still felt like a violation, but there was a different kind of hand in Richard's, practical, respectful. He talked about staging the house in a way that preserved its character. "Leave the stained glass if you wanted," he suggested carefully. He offered, in a way that was neither intrusive nor assumptive, to coordinate showings at times I approved. The thought of letting someone in who would not treat our history like a nuisance steadied me. That night, I sat with the house humming around me, the washing machine's soft whir, the distant television of a neighbor. Michael's footsteps had become a rarer cadence. I placed Harold's watch, the watch he had taken from his father, on the kitchen table and straightened its chain as if measuring time anew. In the quiet, the idea of selling felt less like giving up and more like cutting a cord that had become entangling. I had plucked kindness past the point where it did me any good. I had to make room again. But there are practicalities to any act of reclamation. If you remove a root, the ground shifts. If you put a house on the market, you must document ownership, request statements, and ensure titles are clear. I called Mr. Goldstein and arranged to have an initial consultation so that the listing would be clean and so that there would be no surprise claims. He advised me to gather any relevant documents that pertained to the title. Rose offered to help organize the papers she and I had been sorting. Mr. Reynolds promised to expedite a review of accounts if something was in the offing. I had not expected to be scared, but I was. Scared that calling Richard might precipitate resentment. Scared that my son would resent me for changing his life again. Scared that the house might be stripped of everything that mattered, while the legal machinery turned slowly. There was also a curious private relief. Action feels like power when the only alternative is being carried by other people's intentions. The next morning, a contractor showed up, an appointment Richard had scheduled to assess the property's market value. Vanessa opened the door as if seeing him was a matter of course, but there was a sharpness to her smile. She asked questions in an even tone and then walked through rooms with the kind of possession that made my skin go cold. At one point, she lingered by the landing and looked up at the absence where the stained glass had been replaced with a dull pane. "You're selling?" she asked, and I said yes. It felt enormous and yet simple to answer. Yes. Her eyebrows rose the way they do when she grades a subtle inconvenience. "I suppose that makes sense," she said. "You should tell people your house is antique. It'll attract the right buyers." It was not meant as a snub. It was a map. This is the life they preferred, and this is the life they would show to the world. I told her nothing about my fear. I simply moved about the house with a new purpose, touching surfaces, remembering Harold's hands smoothing a table edge as if to transfer some of his steadiness into my fingertips. That evening I sat in the kitchen and wrote a note I would keep in my wallet. Names and numbers: Mr. Reynolds, Mr. Goldstein, Rose, Richard. Beneath them I wrote the words I had not let myself say aloud. No criminal charges unless necessary. Settlement and closure preferred. It was not perfection. It was a moral compromise I could live with. I love my son. Even when people injure us, love sometimes remains. I was not a woman who desired punishment in full glare. I wanted restoration of my dignity and a halt to the slow erosion. The negotiation between patience and resolve had begun. Later that week, Mr. Goldstein came over. He is the sort of man who wears his calm like a coat. He laid out the steps in simple, accessible terms. He spoke of titles, of notification letters to occupants, of what an off-market sale entails, and what protections we should consider. He suggested sending a certified letter informing the occupants of our intent to list the house, giving them proper notice consistent with local requirements. The idea of paper, a certified envelope sliding into a mailbox, carried with it a strange kind of finality. We agreed, reluctantly and with tenderness toward the son I had raised, that making the move openly and legally was the right course. I told him I did not want criminal retribution. I wanted no one to suffer in the way revenge visits wounds on everyone. Instead, I wanted a solution that required accountability, and yet preserved the possibility of repair, however tenuous. That night, I lay awake and remembered Harold's handwriting, precise and loving, the loops and the little ticks that showed when he paused to think. I thought of the lemon tart recipe he had perfected, and the way he would declare a bowl of cherries the cause for an impromptu picnic. I remembered how he had taught me to stand up straight in the face of small humiliations, because sometimes those small humiliations are the first signs of erosion. Harold had taught me to notice. When the letter went out, certified with a return receipt, I felt a curious lightness. The house felt like a body that had been bandaged. It had a wound, but now someone had acknowledged it. I told myself that acknowledgement was the first step to healing. We agreed to list discreetly. Richard found a retired couple from the city who adored the charm older houses offered, people who spoke with reverence about old mantels and careful carpentry. We spoke in hushed tones about not announcing the sale widely, about leaving the stained glass if I wished, about preserving the small things that made me human. At the same time, the practical work of tracing financial records began. Mr. Reynolds scheduled an appointment with a private investigator to reconcile dates. Rose promised, with a wick of sternness, to continue searching Harold's files for any indication of prior behavior. There was a feeling among us, cautious, expectant, that the documents would tell a story different from the polite face Vanessa kept. I will not say it was all done with a neatness that made the story cinematic. Reality never is. There were nights when I sat surrounded by papers and cried openly for the life that had been dismantled, for the days when my son's laugh was a secure place. There were afternoons when Michael would call and his voice would be a hesitant thing, overfull with confusion and embarrassment. He said things like, "I didn't see it, Mom," and I wanted to believe him. I wanted to be relieved. But the ledger pages and the missing brooch and the smear of disinfectant where stained glass used to be whispered a different truth. And yet, where there is pain, there can also be growth. To give you an image, I began taking a watercolor class at the community center. Painting can seem frivolous when your home feels like a contested territory, but there is a kind of order in painting that stitched me back together. The act of watching water and pigment do what they wished taught me something about letting life's edges blur and still make a pattern. I learned to paint a lemon tart with soft shadows. I learned to watch other people's hands as they worked and noticed small grounding details, calluses, a thoughtful frown, the way a widow in the class arranged her brushes like an arsenal of hope. I did not know, when I picked up the brush, that it would become the way I breathed while the rest of my life rearranged. There are practical moments that follow any decision: a certified notice, an inspection, a call from a potential buyer, a meeting to decide whether to preserve the stained glass window as a point of sale. But there are also interior moments when you feel the world tilt and you decide what you are willing to accept. For me, the pivot was that evening after Vanessa's command. I had lived in a house with my husband and then with my son. I had tried to be supportive, but being supportive doesn't mean giving yourself away. It took a violent sentence, "Get out. We want our space," to translate my kindness into movement. So I made the call to Richard. I signed the initial paperwork with a hand that trembled in the way tremors do when they are not only physical, but moral. I told Mr. Goldstein my preferences. I asked Mr. Reynolds to look deeper. I asked Rose to keep watch in Harold's office. I did it not to spite anyone, but because I had to live without being diminished. The next morning, and here is where things thicken, where the path forks, I found that the ledger was not the only proof of an unfolding story. There were small physical alterations that mattered in a way numbers do not. The staircase landing missing its stained glass now revealed a blankness that seemed designed to erase memory. I took photographs for my records with a small camera I had used in brighter times. Each picture felt like a snapshot of an injury. When I look back, I see that the calling of the Realtor was the first time I reclaimed not only property, but also my narrative. It was the moment I told the world and myself that I would not be an invisible presence in my own life. There was fear, and there was sorrow, and there was a sense of finality that both relieved and frightened me. I cannot tell you with simple sentences that everything was resolved then. It was not. But the house that once belonged to my parents-in-law, that had been the cradle of our lives, was now a battleground for dignity. And so I signed the listing agreement with a certain reluctant steadiness. The house was on the market, quietly, discreetly, and a string of checks and documents began to gather in my kitchen, small, factual things that would prove useful later. It felt like weaving a net while the waves rose beneath me. I drove to the community center that afternoon and let watercolor wash over the edges of my grief. In the painting studio, an older man who had lost his wife spoke of how the irises bloomed even in winter in a corner of his garden. "You don't get to pick where life cuts you," he said, "but you get to decide what you plant next." I let that image sit. The house was listed quietly. A certified letter was in motion. Mr. Reynolds had his binder. Rose was still combing through files. I slept and woke with a curious mix of dread and relief. There were things I had not yet discovered. I knew that because there is always more beneath the surface when people change the locks on memory. A few days later, a packet arrived at my kitchen table in an unremarkable brown envelope. It was from Rose, who had found a small folder in Harold's desk that she thought I should see. The folder contained notes, names, dates, scraps of intuition Harold had kept like talismans. There was a sentence in his handwriting that made me sit down as if the room were spinning. Keep records. Watch for patterns. He had always been the kind of man who wrote instructions to his future self, and now his notes felt like a compass. The compass pointed toward a single, uneasy truth. Whatever had been happening was not the result of one absent-minded oversight. The pieces suggested pattern, and patterns, when stitched together, make motives visible. I laid out the papers on the table like puzzle pieces. They were small, an appointment card here, a receipt there, but together they hummed with implication. At the end of that long week, I realized I had stepped into a strange new life, one in which I made calls, arranged meetings, filed certified letters, and took watercolor classes on Tuesday afternoons. Each activity recalibrated me. I was no longer the woman who swallowed slights with a smile. I was a woman who documented things, who asked questions, who kept watch. That night, in the quiet, I allowed myself a small indulgence. I sat by the empty stair landing and looked at the place where the stained glass had once fractured morning into color. I imagined it restored, light thrown like confetti, and imagined myself older and steadier. I thought about Harold's watch, ticking in its wooden case, and wondered, not unkindly, what he would have said to me that I needed this to happen. Perhaps he would have urged patience. Perhaps he would have taken me by the elbow and said, "Eleanor, you know how to breathe through this." His voice, in memory, is always a limber thing. I fell asleep with the sound of the house around me, the fridge's polite hum, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the pension of the grandfather clock. There were papers on the table that insisted on a future of reckoning. There was an off-market listing being prepared. There was a certified letter on its way. There was a son who said he did not see, and a woman who had told me I needed to get out. And there was me, an old woman with a watercolor bag and a folder of documents, deciding what to do next. The decision had been made. The world would have to adjust. The packet from Rose sat on my kitchen table like a summons. Inside were copies, Xeroxed and weathered, of notes Harold had kept. Names, snippets of phone numbers, a grocery list here, an appointment card there. Tucked between the pages was a small typed itinerary of transactions Rose had found in an old expense folder that matched dates on the ledger Mr. Reynolds had flagged. The pieces that had hummed in my hand now had a rhythm. When Mr. Reynolds came the next morning, he brought the kind of patient attention that can make a person feel both smaller and steadier at once. He spread the statements like a map and pointed. "These withdrawals," he said, "they don't read like household expenses. They're frequent, and they're to accounts and cards that aren't household accounts. We're looking at a pattern, repeated use over months." He didn't imagine numbers would make me cry. They did. Not because the numbers themselves were pretty, they were not, but because they made abstract betrayal concrete. There was something about seeing dates and places beside the notation card 04XX that turned a polite household slight into a trail of intent. We agreed on the next steps. A private investigator to reconcile transaction dates with the times Vanessa and Michael were in town, and a more detailed look from Mr. Goldstein at the legal documents Rose had found. Discretion was still our watchword. The last thing I wanted was gossip carved into the neighborhood hedges. But there is a difference between quiet and secrecy. Quiet is a choice to act sensibly. Secrecy is the cruelty of tolerating wrong for fear of rocking the boat. The private investigator called himself Gable, a steady man with an unremarkable voice and a polite tendency to overstate caution. He began by verifying the sequences Mr. Reynolds had circled. He obtained statements, cross-referenced dates, and quietly shadowed patterns. The PI's notes arrived in a thin folder, each page annotated in an economy of ink. When I opened it, my throat closed. There were card charges that lined up with dates I remembered, birthday dinners Vanessa had attended without me, late-night deliveries on days when the house was supposed to be quiet. There were withdrawals from ATM locations that suggested long, secret runs. The PI's report did not editorialize. It mapped time. It showed that unaccounted withdrawals and card usages were not anomalies but a habit. The next piece came from Mr. Goldstein. He called me into the study and placed a photocopy on the coffee table, his hands framing the page like he was showing me a fragile animal. It was a property transfer document, with a signature that looked, at first glance, like mine. But he had a magnifier and a quiet way of explaining the things a layperson may not notice. A loop where there shouldn't be one. A pressure that did not match my cursive. A date that had been altered. "This looks forged," he said without his voice rising. "There are several versions of the same transfer in different folders. We need to have a handwriting expert, and to confirm chain of custody for each document." The word "forged" sat on the table between us and made the house seem very small and very public at once. Rose arrived that afternoon with another envelope. She had been persistent in the way people who have seen too many things wrong are, soft at first, then necessary. She placed an additional packet beside Mr. Goldstein's pages. One of the letters held something I had almost forgotten. A short note Harold had written to himself, a reminder to watch patterns, and a list of a few names that he thought suspect in the past. No accusation, only caution. Rose had also found a receipt for a locksmith from the month before. It listed a service for a lock change that had not been performed on any of the accounts I had authorized. There was a feeling then that the story had teeth. The pattern, the charges, the paper trail, Harold's own habit of keeping records. Together they formed a scaffolding that made a motive more visible. It was not the single dramatic theft of a purse. It was the slow siphoning of trust that had been draining my life. We assembled our evidence cautiously. Mr. Reynolds collated bank statements and highlighted amounts that had been rerouted. The PI tied particular transactions to dates and locations. Mr. Goldstein arranged for an expert to analyze the questionable signature on the transfer forms. The pieces were dry and methodical. They were the opposite of melodrama. But when we gathered them on the coffee table that afternoon, statements, receipts, copies of the forged document, the torn edge of the brooch's appraisal that Rose had located in a folder, we were composing something inevitable, a confrontation. I had imagined dramatic confrontations before, the sort you see in television where doors slam and people shout and the guilty are brought to their knees. Real life does not always wait until the cameras are ready. It waits until your heart can handle it, and your documents are undeniable. We picked an afternoon when Michael would be home. I called him and asked him to come by. He arrived slow-footed and hollow-eyed, not yet the man who would later enter therapy and do the hard, quiet work of repair, but beginning to show the first cracks of self-awareness. We sat in the living room. The chandelier threw a pale, obedient light on the folders. I set them down one by one. There was a ritual to it. Open a file, lay it flat, let the paper speak. Mr. Reynolds explained the account anomalies with a professional economy. The PI detailed charges that matched outings and purchases I had never authorized. Mr. Goldstein produced the copy of the transfer with the suspect's signature. Michael watched as the afternoon moved. He does not shout. He is more likely to withdraw into the silence that used to be his refuge. But the room had an electric quality in that long, low way that precedes confession. When the folder with the brooch appraisal was opened, he asked in a voice that felt thin as tissue, "Where did that come from?" "It's gone," I said. "The brooch is gone, Michael. The stained glass is out, and your wife told me to get out of my own house." He pressed his hands together until the knuckles went white. "Mom, His voice failed. He looked at the documents, at the forgery, at the calendar of withdrawals. His face, which I had watched shape my son's laughter for 38 years, folded in toward something raw. I watched him meet the fact of it, like a man learning the depth of water in a new dive. When Vanessa walked in, she was what she had always been in public, composed, clean lines, the cool cloth of someone who moves with intent. She paused at the doorway, her eyes calculating. The living room, the carpet, the chandelier, the coffee table with its neat stacks, suddenly felt like a stage and a weighing table. I spread the folders like a map. "These are the bank statements," I said. "These are the receipts, and this is a copy of a transfer that appears to have a forged signature. Mr. Reynolds, the PI, and Mr. Goldstein are all here." Vanessa took a step forward. Her hand found the arm of a chair like a woman steadying herself against news she had been waiting to become inconvenient. Her voice was measured. "What are you doing, Eleanor?" I kept my voice low. "I'm giving you the courtesy of facts. If I'm wrong, then you will have cleared your name. If I'm right, then I will pursue what is necessary to protect what remains. But before any of that happens, I want to offer you a reasonable way to resolve this." She smiled the way someone who has practiced smiles. "Are you threatening me?" "No." I allowed my jaw to be steady. "I am telling you what we know and giving you the chance to do the right thing." You could see the tilt in her attention then, toward offense, toward defense, toward the instinct to control the narrative. Michael's face was a study in collapse and then in slow recognition. He had been the boy I had told stories to under blankets. He had been the man who sometimes chose comfort over courage. Now he moved as if a weight had been removed, a small surrender, and an admission that would cost him dearly to make real. Words were not enough. We had to put options on the table. Mr. Goldstein, who had been a reserve of legal calm, began to outline what could happen. A private settlement that included relinquishment of claims against the house, an agreement to vacate, restoration of items where possible, and a no-contact clause in exchange for our not pursuing criminal charges. He also repeated, clear and careful, that filing criminal charges was a choice he would support if we decided that was necessary. That, he said, would be a different path and would require building a formal case with everything we had compiled. I had written those words in my wallet weeks earlier. No criminal charges unless necessary. Settlement and closure preferred. The phrase had become more than a list. It was my moral frame. I did not want spectacle. I did not want to break a son for the sake of justice, whatever justice may demand. I wanted accountability that restored my dignity and halted the erosion. I wanted a way for Michael to stand with me rather than against me. Vanessa's face hardened. She made a small, ironic noise. "We have rights, too," she said. "You can't just—" "You have rights," Mr. Goldstein said, "but your rights do not include forging documents or misappropriating funds. If you choose to contest this, we will have to pursue the documents and the financial trail through formal means. If you choose to cooperate, we can work out a settlement that avoids public proceedings." I watched the room. My heart moved like something learning to trust itself again. Michael's shoulders sagged. "Mom," he said finally, his voice low and full of hurt, I didn't look. I should have. I'm sorry." That apology was small, but it was the shape of something that could be rebuilt. Vanessa's eyes flashed and then softened. Only a little. Catherine stood at the doorway, having been called by a neighbor who feared the house had become a stage. She looked at the folders and then at me. She had been a presence on the periphery of our family, kind but not intimate, and there was a complex sheet of loyalty in her face. "I don't know what happened," she began, the way someone who had been told of an accident might begin. "But I don't want to see this family torn apart." The solution that came together was not perfect, and it was not swift. We negotiated over several sessions with Mr. Goldstein as mediator. Vanessa agreed to return certain items where she could, to vacate the house within a set timeline, to sign a release of claim regarding ownership, and to accept a non-criminal agreement that relieved me of the necessity of pursuing charges. In exchange, Mr. Goldstein advised that a civil settlement around the disputed funds would be prudent. We required also that there be no contact, an explicit boundary, to ensure I would not be subject to further intrusions while the sale proceeded. It was a compromise. It preserved my dignity and allowed Michael the space to choose what kind of man he would become. It did not, and could not, erase the harm. It did not recover the brooch in all of its meaning, but it halted the ongoing consumption of my life. The days that followed were a blur of more practicalities, an inventory of items to remain with the house, an appraisal that acknowledged both the house's charm and the need to preserve certain fixtures, and an off-market signing where the buyers, an older couple from Chicago who adored older houses and learned the language of mantels and wainscoting, came to see the home. They walked attic and stair and porch with a reverence I had not expected. Their voices softened over the stained glass landing as if they too could feel the memory it held. The woman, her hands cupped like a prayer, said, "We'll take care of her." The sale was discreet. Richard arranged it the way he had promised. Careful showings at times that suited me, a few select buyers who would respect the history. The retired couple offered terms that were reasonable. I did not pry into their bank statements. I only listened as they described Sunday breakfasts and a small garden they would plant. It felt like handing a child into trustworthy hands. On the day the keys changed hands, I did something I had not expected. I stood at the front step with a lemon tart I had baked and handed one to the new woman who would now make the porch her morning. We stood in the doorway as the movers carried the last of the boxes out, some things that had been mine, some of Harold's, some items that had always been part of the house's edges. The couple hugged each other and then turned to me with a tenderness that surprised me. "You'll come by sometimes," the woman said. "I'd like to hear stories about this place." I nodded. I felt the sting of goodbye and also the odd warmth of having chosen the terms on which I left. I had called the Realtor. I had signed the listing. I had sold the house. The act was not a vindictive gesture. It was a reclaimed move. My name was on the deed. I had the authority to do what I did. I had not needed to wait for someone else to authorize my life. The settlement with Vanessa and Michael closed quietly. The non-criminal terms were spelled out with the clinical neatness of law: relinquishment of claim, vacatur by a certain date, a non-contact clause, a financial settlement to address the most egregious of the account anomalies. It was not a full repair. It was a stopgap that allowed me to breathe. The police were not involved, and no criminal charges were filed, at least not by me. That decision rested on a complicated mix of maternal love, a desire for closure, and the belief that my son needed the chance to heal without the public weight of prosecution. There were consequences, certainly. Vanessa left with the settlement. Michael moved out for a while and sought therapy. He apologized again, in small gestures that grew over months. He attended a watercolor class with me once, then twice. He delivered groceries when I could not. He donated to the support group we started. It was not an overnight change. Trust was rebuilt in increments. As the house left my life, I found the spaces it freed were not emptiness, but room to breathe. I began to throw myself into the quiet work of restoring myself. My watercolor class became less of a pastime and more of a practice. I painted the lemon tarts Harold loved, the maples in their late golden season, the stained glass colors as memory. Painting taught me to watch pigment mingle and then settle. It taught me patience. Then, slowly, the thing grew outward. At a support group meeting at the community center, I met other people with similar stories. Small thefts that had hollowed out lives, children who had eased into entitlement, friends who had become strangers. We met over coffee that tasted of too much sugar and under fluorescent lights that did not flatter anyone. The sessions were practical and kind, people lending names of trustworthy accountants, a woman who had challenged her son's card use, a man who had discovered forged checks. There was grief, yes, but there was also a shared thread of possibility. I became part of their thread. We named the group Senior Guardians, an awkward name at first, but one that spoke to the need for older people to protect each other and themselves. We began by meeting weekly, and then we began hosting larger sessions. A seminar on reading bank statements without panic, a talk from a local elder rights counselor, someone who would not give legal advice but could point toward resources. Mr. Reynolds volunteered to speak about the kind of anomalies to watch for. Rose showed up and taught people how to organize old files. We were practical, and we were human. One evening, during our third group session, Michael entered quietly. He sat in the back and listened while an older man described the first time he realized his credit card had been used in ways he had not authorized. After the meeting, Michael approached the little cluster of us who stayed to clear the chairs. He put his hand on my shoulder in a way that asked for permission, and then offered an apology that was, at last, more than words. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry I let this happen. I know I should have been more vigilant. I'm going to therapy. I want to do whatever it takes." He had been in therapy for months. He had met with a counselor who helped him see how his avoidance had enabled harm. His repentance was not the theatrical kind. It was the kind that demanded he show up to small obligations, a promise to check statements, to communicate honestly, to accept boundaries. I told him I forgave him in principle, and that trust would be rebuilt slowly, and only if he respected the terms we had set. He agreed. We watched change in tiny increments after that, new habits that added up. He came to class with a cup of coffee and a humble offering of croissants. He called to ask if I needed a ride to an appointment. He attended a community center event where we spoke with a lawyer about rights for elders. He brought cookies to a support group meeting and listened while others spoke of their losses. As the months passed, our community rallied around a benefit we organized to raise awareness and funds for elder advocacy programs. We held it at the community center. The retired couple from Chicago sent a small bouquet with a note that said they felt honored to live in a house with a history. Rose prepared a brief presentation on how to maintain files. Mr. Reynolds spoke kindly about the numbers to watch for. I spoke awkwardly and then with more confidence about the moment a woman tells you to get out of your own house. The fundraiser felt like a reclamation of narrative. It was not about making Vanessa look small. It was about giving voice to those who had been exploited and showing how dignity could be restored. People listened, and some cried. A local columnist, indefinite and careful, wrote about the event in a piece that spoke of resilience without sensationalism. The money we raised was given to a local elder rights nonprofit. We supported workshops on financial literacy and free sessions with accountants who volunteered their time. I felt that, at last, some of the harm had been turned into remedy, however small. One evening, after the benefit, Mr. Goldstein handed me an envelope he had found while sorting through Harold's things. Something Rose had missed. It was a letter in Harold's looping, precise hand. He had written to me in a way he had always written, when he wanted to be both comforting and firm. He had written about little things, how to freeze lemon tarts, where he kept the extra button jar, but he had also written, in a few lines, about courage and attention. Keep records, he had underlined, and keep your life even as you help others. Make room for yourself. I read the letter in the late light and felt Harold's voice like a hand at the small of my back. There was no instruction there that would tell me exactly what to do next. There was only the pattern of the man I loved in his practice of watching and noting. It felt like permission, finally, to be both kind and firm. We did not return every wound into a neat resolution. Vanessa's departure left a silence that would not be neatly filled. The brooch was not recovered in the way one recovers an heirloom. Some things remain missing. But the house was sold. The new owners kept the stained glass. They promised to cherish the porch, and they invited me to visit if I wished. I visited once in the spring when the maples were shallow with new green. The couple welcomed me with tea and a shy reverence for the house's stories. We spoke of lemon tarts and of Harold's ledger and of how homes hold more than walls. In the months that followed, I organized more support group meetings. We created a small packet of resources, names of accountants, a checklist for suspicious transactions, a sample letter of notification. We made friends with a counselor who offered sliding scale therapy sessions for adult children who wanted to make amends. We kept our promises to each other. Michael and I, in time, found a new cadence. It was cautious and realistic. He has his therapy appointments. He attends meetings when he can. He joked once, tentatively, about taking a watercolor lesson, and then confessed he prefers to watch me paint. We have dinners more often now, carefully planned and not rushed. He takes responsibility for things he missed before. He apologizes more than he used to. We do not pretend the past did not happen. We learn from it. When people ask me about the moment I called Richard and arranged the sale, I tell them it was an act of reclamation. Calling the Realtor felt like drawing a line under the sentence Vanessa had shouted at me. It did not make me cruel. It made me deliberate. It was not the end of grief, but it was a way to move toward a life that did not revolve around being diminished. As I write those words now, the house is no longer mine in the way it used to be. But the memory of Harold's watch ticking and the smell of lemon tart carried across the porch are stitched into me like a seam. There is still anger sometimes, a hot, quick thing that comes when I see an old habit returning. But the anger is not the only story. There is also a quieter pride in the way the support group has grown, in the way neighbors come together, and in the fact that I found a new purpose in the wake of being wronged. I do not present myself as a perfect example. I missed things. I let kindness become an unguarded pass. But I learned to set boundaries without shrinking into bitterness. I learned that asking for help is not weakness. I discovered that community could be a defense as well as a comfort. There are nights when I sit at my small kitchen table, the radio on low, watercolor drying on a rack nearby, and I think of the moment Vanessa said, "Get out. We want our space." It still makes my breath hitch. But now, when I close my eyes, I see a different map. The maples in spring, the sunlight through restored stained glass, a group of seniors clustered in the community center, hands in motion, papers spread, voices ordinary and resolute. I see Michael learning to watch and to act. I see Harold's letter on my mantle, a small persistent compass. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, other than a warning to keep your records and to keep your life, it is that dignity can be reclaimed. It can be messy, and it will often be slow. But it is possible. I made choices that felt right to me, to document rather than accuse in public, to seek settlement rather than spectacle, to sell the house rather than let it continually erode my daily life. I told my story, I gathered allies, and I moved forward. If my experience speaks to you, if you have been on the receiving end of small betrayals that add up, or if you care for someone who might be vulnerable, please, in the comments, share where you're watching from, and, if you feel comfortable, a small line about what you've learned. Your voice might be the first step for someone else. Thank you for listening to mine. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, or to follow the work of our support group as it grows, please subscribe. Share your story. We are not helpless when we document, when we protect, and when we choose boundaries. We are, even in our later years, capable of making new maps of our lives, maps that include safety, dignity, and hope.